Our next speaker, is Chris Beaumont-Smith from Manitoba Mines Branch. Chris was appointed the Director of Mines Branch in the Department of Mineral Resources in 2015. He had joined the Mines Branch after acting as manager of the Mineral Policy and Business Development Mineral Resources, and before that he was hired as a mineral deposit geologist with the Manitoba Geological Survey. He's from New Brunswick. He received his Bachelor of Science and PhD in Structural Geology from the University of New Brunswick. Before joining the Manitoba government, Chris has worked with several major Canadian gold and base metal exploration and mining companies. And I can tell you right now, it's like he can spout out stuff so fast, like his brain just works so well. So here you've got Chris. Thank you. He's going to talk about mine closure.
Unfortunately, my expertise is limited to Trivial Pursuit. Thank you very much for the kind words. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the end game. Unfortunately, for a non-renewable resource, the inevitability of mine closure. So I will certainly approach this from the government perspective, and that is through our statutory and regulatory requirements. And in that context, we'll look at bit of history, what's required in the terms of mine closure plans and the financial security that supports those. We'll look at some of the objectives of the rehabilitation of mine sites, and because this is coming from government, and I think everyone in the room, all the Manitobans in the room, should be very proud of what this province is doing in the context of dealing with some of our major legacy issues for the mining sector, and that is looking at the rehabilitation of orphaned and abandoned mines in Manitoba, because we are clearly leading the country in this regard. So, and I don't mean to single Hudson Bay out here, just that this picture gives us a great view of what some of the challenges are for mine closure. This is their Flin Flon integrated mining and metallurgical complex, and I think that speaks to our industry here in Manitoba, where we have two very significant integrated complexes, Flin Flon and Thompson, and that's a real testament to the history of the mining sector in Manitoba. But with that comes a series of challenges. This is a satellite image. I just pulled this down off Google, just to give you some context of the scale of what the eventual rehabilitation of this site is going to entail. For any of you who are familiar with Flin Flon, the metallurgical complex is here, 777 mine's here, Trout Lake mine is here, and the tailings management area is here. And to put that in context, that's greater than, here's Walmart, that's greater than the size of the city of Flin Flon. So these sites can be very large and present some very real challenges. From the government's perspective, mine closure comes under the Mines and Minerals Act from 1992. And I mentioned the date intentionally, and I'll speak to this later as far as orphan sites go. The current requirements for mine closure and the financial security that supports that didn't come into effect, legal effect, until 1992. So any mines that closed before that, there was no retroactive grandfathering or anything like that. So as you'll see, the Crown became the proud owner of a number of sites that we are now cleaning up and rehabilitating. But it speaks to the need for a robust and regulatory regime to support mine closure. So essentially, the requirement of the mine closure legislation is that a mine closure plan has to be accepted before development of a site can begin. And that applies for all mines and non-aggregate quarries and private non-aggregate quarries. And a unique part of our legislation is what's called advanced exploration. The vernacular of the mining sector, advanced exploration, is you're into the resource definition and you've made a discovery. In the context of our act, advanced exploration is actually the authorization to conduct initial mine development to extract up to a 10,000-ton bulk sample. So this effectively is mine development. So that's why it falls under the requirement under the mine closure regulation. And another thing that Manitoba does quite well is that we charge a 12-cent per ton rehabilitation levy on all aggregate produced in Manitoba. That's both off Crown lands and off of freehold or private lands. And that goes into a fund that's used to rehabilitate progressively and exhausted quarries, whether they be private or on Crown land, to the tune we do approximately $2.5 to $3 million a year of rehabilitation. So this is a very effective program. It applies to all quarries just so that there's no loopholes for people to go through, and we ensure that all quarries eventually get rehabilitated. So, as I said, before mine development can begin, and it's generally it goes hand in glove with the Environment Act application or project description phase, and that approved is there intentionally. The mine closure plan has to be submitted and approved by Mines Branch, and quite often that involves circulation to other departments with regulatory oversight, and financial security for that plan is required. So what is required? This is by no means a comprehensive list, but I wouldn't be able to fit. Our regulation is quite prescriptive, so I sort of took the highlights here, but certainly it requires a summary of the dispositions, both surface and mineral dispositions, site plan, summary of all workings and disturbances, and just like with the Environment Act review process, this would be a summary of everything anticipated for the mine through full development as outlined in the project description. Summary of the mine process and any waste treatment, assessment of stability of all mine workings. This is more of a requirement at closure, but certainly process needs to be outlined in the closure plan of how that will be determined and what will encompass. The plan to remove all surface infrastructure and the plan for storage and remediation of the tailings management area, and quite importantly is the schedule for the operation and the decommissioning work. And we are like almost all other jurisdictions. The environmental liability for a mine is the proponent currently is never released from that obligation. So we need certainly a detailed post-closure monitoring plan to ensure the compliance with both federal and provincial regulations, and to go along with the next slide, a cost estimate for both the closure, all the decommissioning, and the monitoring. So we are rather unique in Canada that we provide quite a variety of financial vehicles to support to provide the financial security for mine closure. Certainly our preferred is cash or a bond deposit. I can tell you we get very few of those. And certainly that's one we acknowledge, and this is why we try to provide flexibility, is that it's challenging enough for a company, unless you're a very large company, to raise the capital, to let alone build a mine, but to actually put the upfront costs of decommissioning on the table when you start. So accordingly, we try to provide some flexibility to companies. So in that regard, one thing we have which is quite unique is that we allow the larger companies that have sufficiently high bond ratings to essentially guarantee the mine closure costs based on their bond rating. That would apply to companies like the one that comes to mind immediately would be Vale, a very large multinational company. Obviously, investment certificates, the most common security we get is an irrevocable unconditional line of credit. And I should probably put this right here. We have there's a means test that you can find on our website that lays out how companies qualify for this and some of the conditions that come along with that. And I have the great pleasure of being able to approve other financial vehicles. And I guess the one that's most common that we have accepted in the past, it's not one that we prefer, and I'll be honest, we're trying to move away from that, is a pledge of assets. I think most people will recognize that if you plan and develop a mine properly, when it comes to the end of life, there shouldn't be any value left in those assets. So it's, as I said, that's one that we have. There is precedent for accepting it, but we are certainly moving away from that and trying to move more into something that's a little more guaranteed, such as the letter of credit. So what are the objectives of mine rehabilitation? Well, obviously we would like to be able to bring the mine or the mine site back to its original condition, or as close as possible. For a lot of sites, that is really not reasonable, particularly from a financial perspective. So we sort of default to number 2, which is to make the site environmentally benign, so there are no ongoing impacts to the local environment, and that hopefully that site can become productive in the future. So if we look at some of the priority areas that we look at in mine closure, one is the protection of public health and safety. So this is particularly a case of underground mines where we have vent raises and areas that clearly could present a physical hazard to the general public. Secondly, as I mentioned, it's to eliminate ongoing environmental damage. So we're looking at chemical stability, surface and groundwater, issues of decommissioning tailings management areas, particularly from base metal operations where acid mine drainage is always a concern. And as we said, trying to make the land acceptable for future use. And as I said, these are all included in the plan before it starts. So I just threw up a couple examples. I pulled these down off the Noami site. We have a large number of sites that have been remediated in Manitoba. Unfortunately, the pictures I have of them didn't do them justice, so I'll just give a couple here. This is the Buckens mine in central Newfoundland, and this is their tailings management area. And this is a pretty standard practice of putting a cover on the particularly base metal tailings that are acid generating. So under here would be an impermeable, some sort of engineered cover, generally compacted clay, but sometimes it's synthetic products such as high-density polyethylene, and with a growth medium, and then having the area revegetated to stop erosion. I included this one because I thought this was really quite well done. This is an open pit mine in Alberta, and they've gone to considerable lengths to really make this I can see in a few years that's going to be quite a lovely site and hardly recognizable. This reminds me, just a real quick aside here, is that I'm a very avid golfer and I watch a lot of golf on TV, and I was watching a golf tournament in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and the golf course was called The Mines, and I thought that was very interesting, so I did some digging, and it turns out this 5-star resort is located at the site of the former largest open pit tin mine in Southeast Asia. So anything, as the engineers tell me, with enough money, anything is possible. And finally, I thought I'd include the Homestake. This was the largest gold mine on the continent, produced just 99, actually they didn't make 100, 99.5 million ounces of gold. It operated for 114 years, and they have done a remarkable job remediating that site. So that brings, we've looked at what our requirements are for companies that exist now and that are operating now. One of our biggest challenges is because of the lack of regulatory authority up until 1992, and actually the mine closure regulations did not come into effect until 1999. We have a large number of sites in Manitoba that have become the responsibility of the Crown. Another reason for this, and this is not widely known, is that we have a large number, and I think this is really across the country, large number of small, particularly gold mines went bankrupt during the Second World War. And those have become the responsibility of the provinces, but I would argue that the federal government should be paying for these cleanups, because what happened was that with the War Measures Act was invoked, and because gold mines were not considered part of the war effort, they were prevented by federal a regulation from being able to acquire equipment. So for many of these, they were driven into bankruptcy by federal regulation. But I guess now we just have to deal with it. But certainly our process started in the late 90s. The government recognized that it was carrying a fairly significant liability, and that certainly not just internal pressure, but for many of our major sites, they're adjacent to the communities that were established to support those operations, and there was considerable concern on the part of those communities that these sites, the environmental impacts of these sites needed to be addressed. So those sites, sort of the poster child for this would be the Farley or the Sherritt-Gordon's nickel operations in Lynn Lake, the Sheridan base metal operations that closed in 1952. That was also Sherritt-Gordon. God's Lake, which was one of these small gold mines that closed during the Second World War, Baker Pat near Flin Flon, and the old Noracme tailings at Snow Lake. In addition to that, in 2007, the government had identified 149 sites that they believed that they had determined that they were the responsibility of the Crown. We engaged AMEC to conduct an assessment of these sites, and they determined that of the 149, 31 were high risk or high hazard and needed to be addressed, and 5 sites, the 5 larger sites, were critical. And shortly thereafter, this was recognized by the Auditor General, and the government chose to accept the recommendation of the Auditor General, and they established the environmental liabilities account, and based on AMEC's estimate, populated that account with $220 million that we have used. It's since been upgraded to $310 million to deal with all our major sites, and for several of them, ongoing future water treatment requirements. So the way we operate our program is through a competitive bidding process. We select an engineering consultant to both do site assessment, project design, and contract management, and they proceed to design the project and tender it and hire or recommend to us a contractor to conduct the cleanup. In 1987, the Rattan mine site, through an agreement with Hudson Bay, this is at the time when the mine was sold, Sherritt-Gordon sold the operation to Hud Bay Minerals, and at that point the government agreed that they would cap Hud Bay's liability for decommissioning the site at $18 million. So we have been the Crown has been responsible for the balance of the cleanup, and that's currently, that's a picture of the site. This is quite an enormous site. Just for context or for scale, this is the open pit. That's 1 kilometer long. This is probably our largest project right now. It's currently budgeted at about $65 million. The largest project we've undertaken to date is the Farley project in Lynn Lake. That was joint with Viridian, and the total project costs for that were $77 million. So I think this does also reflect back to the financial securities that companies have to post. Some of these sites, the cost estimates for closure can be very significant. So just to briefly summarize, this comes from the AMEC's original 2007, or I guess finally 2008 report, identifying, as you can see, most of the orphan sites are in our traditional established mining camps, and for example, God's Lake, a couple in the more remote gold mines from the 30s. As of this year, we have active rehabilitation on all our our most critical sites, with the Farley site in Lynn Lake having been completed and is now in post-closure monitoring. And 30 of the 31 high-risk sites identified by AMEC have been remediated. The only one outstanding is the final work at the Central Manitoba. I think many of you may be aware of Central Manitoba if you've taken the road from Bessette down to Lac de Bonnie because the highway cuts through the tailings management area, which we are currently rehabilitating. So I think this is kudos to Manitoba for. We will be the first, I think it's on the next slide. Yes, so that's certainly our current status, and we will be the first Canadian jurisdiction to have remediated all of our significant orphan and abandoned mine sites. And I think that's a real kudos to government for having the wherewithal to provide us with the resources to do this. I can tell you Quebec has just announced a similar program. Most other provinces have not formally addressed the ongoing problem of orphan and abandoned mines. And just one thing to mention. Of the 149 sites, most of them actually weren't mines. They're generally advanced exploration sites or exploration sites, things with trenches or small adits and things like that, but they still represent a fairly significant hazard, and they were included in our program. Anyways, thank you very much.